Imagine a man who loves and collects art. His nephew comes to him, excited to share his art. The man looks at it and says, "It's not very good," and throws it away. How does this scene strike you? Does it surprise you? Does it bother you? When we've intentionally decided to be creative, we've made a conscious decision to go after novelty, to entertain something new. Therefore, we have to be careful when we explore novelty to recognize that raw ideas at first are fragile. We need to be cautious in terms of how we respond to those ideas. We have to learn to manage our attitude in order to unleash our imagination and to preserve novelty. This course is aimed at developing creative thinking skills. These skills are enhanced through tools, but we need to pay attention to our mindset. Our mindset serves as a ceiling or a lid for our skills. We can't maximize our skills or use the tools to their fullest potential without the right mindset. In this lecture, we look at that cognitive mindset, the mindset for creative thinking. In a later lecture, in lecture 22, we'll explore more broadly emotions and their relationship to creativity. In the last lecture, we discussed the development of the modern brain and how it developed a capacity to shift from divergent to convergent thinking. The brain reached its present size about 150,000 years ago, and then later it developed contextual focusing skills. This is a term for that ability to shift from divergent to convergent thinking. Language came about 100,000 years ago. So at this point, Homo sapiens had the thinking skills and the language. Is that all we needed to be creative, right? Well, not quite. Remember, the creative explosion didn't occur until about 40,000 years ago. So there was about a 60,000-year gap. What happened during this gap? What was missing? Well, what was missing was the mindset that unshackled our imagination. There's a formula, a mathematical formula that was developed by one of our founding faculty members at Buffalo State. Her name was Ruth Noller. She was a mathematician. In fact, she helped to build the first computer in the US. As a mathematician, she provided a formula that helps us to understand how attitude, mindset, engages with other variables to predict high levels of creativity. And this is her mathematical formula. She suggested that creativity is a function of attitude, small a, as well as knowledge, imagination, and evaluation. Let's start with the three main elements of this formula: knowledge, imagination, and evaluation. And let me ask you a question. Where are children naturally strong in terms of these three elements? When I ask this question to audiences, the immediate response is, well, imagination. Where do children need some help? The response that I get there is knowledge and evaluation. Now let's consider adults. Where are adults naturally strong? The response I often get is knowledge and evaluation. But where do adults need some help? Typical response, imagination. Now, part of what this formula suggests to us is that it's tricky getting the balance right. We need equal amounts of knowledge, imagination, and evaluation. But the second point behind this model is that little a, that creativity is a function of knowledge, imagination, and evaluation, and attitude. You see, without the right attitude, we can't capitalize on our knowledge, imagination, and evaluation. In this lecture, we look at attitude. We look at the mindset towards thinking that supports imagination. In this lecture, we're moving from natural creativity to deliberate creativity. In the last lecture, we talked about how it's natural for us to be able to engage in divergent and convergent thinking. So you see, evolution can occur naturally, and evolution can be sped up through breeding. Creativity is the same way. Creativity occurs naturally, and creativity can be directed. It's like breathing. I'll use breathing as an analogy. No one has to teach us how to breathe. We come into the world knowing how to breathe. This is natural. But there are times we want to be more deliberate about our breathing. If we're playing a musical instrument or we're involved in sports, it's important and valuable to us to be more conscious about our breathing and to learn strategies to be more deliberate. In fact, Tom Watson, a famous golfer, said he didn't learn how to win until he learned how to breathe. We're going to do the same thing with creativity. We're going to move it from natural to deliberate. Why leave our creativity up to chance? There are times when we want to be creative on demand. And we can take lessons from those eminent creators, and in fact, we'll look at Hemingway. Hemingway didn't leave his creativity up to chance. He had a deliberate creative process. When he was writing from home, this was his typical routine. He would begin at 6 in the morning when it was cool and there was little to distract him. He stood at his desk in his bedroom and he worked from left to right, starting with handwriting at first, using hardly any punctuation so that he could build momentum. And then when he felt he had enough material to work with, then he moved to his typewriter. He stopped around noon while he still, as he said, had some juice. At the end of the day, he would chart the number of words that he had written, and then he would take his daily half-mile swim. The next morning, he would reread and revise, and then he would repeat the same process. This was Hemingway's deliberate creative process. This is how he moved creativity from chance to on demand. You can do the same. We'll begin by looking at divergent thinking, this fundamental skill. And we'll examine 4 proven principles for improving divergent thinking, ways to improve your mindset, your attitude. And when I say these are proven, I mean that these come from eminent creators, people like Hemingway, and have been supported by research. And it turns out that creativity training has been demonstrated to have a profound impact on our divergent thinking skills. Here are 4 principles we're going to go through. Defer judgment, go for quantity, make connections, seek novelty. As I go through each of these 4 principles or guidelines, I'll give examples of how Hemingway reflected these same principles. The key principle is to defer judgment. Defer judgment means to temporarily suspend one's evaluation. Now, I said this is the key principle. The reason why I suggested this is the key principle is that it's required for all the others. You've got to get this one right, or it's very difficult to be able to adhere to the other principles and guidelines. Neuroscience gives us some insight into how deferring judgment works. You see, we're creative. We're most creative when our prefrontal lobe, the self-monitoring part of our brain, is less active. Hemingway displayed this when he got up in the morning and began writing with pencil. He worked furiously to capture his ideas. He didn't let punctuation get in his way. He captured half sentences and half thoughts in order to build his momentum, to have enough material to work with. In fact, he said that writing should be free from excessive scrutiny. Remember in our last lecture, the analogy I gave between the accelerator and the brake, and how divergent thinking is like the accelerator and convergent thinking is the brake. It's applying evaluation. You see, Hemingway began every morning by stepping on the accelerator, getting the most out of his imagination. When you start a trip, you always begin with the accelerator first. There's research that has demonstrated the profound positive effects of deferred judgment. In fact, one of the earliest studies of the creative process conducted by another one of our founding faculty members, Sid Parnes. He conducted a simple yet elegant study. We had 2 groups of students. They were given a challenge, a real-life challenge to solve and asked to generate ideas, but the 2 sets of students were given different instructions. One set was told to suspend judgment, not to evaluate their ideas as they were generating them. The second group was told to come up with good ideas, to generate good ideas. And by suggesting good ideas, this communicates the need to evaluate. What they found at the end of the study, when they evaluated the sets of ideas generated by these students, is that those who deferred judgment, who followed that principle, ended up generating twice as many good ideas as those who were told to generate good ideas. You see, judgment kills momentum. When we use judgment prematurely as an individual or in meetings, after judgment occurs, all the creative momentum is lost in a meeting. In our last lecture, we talked about how meetings are often conducted and someone asks for ideas and ideas shared, then it's immediately met with a criticism. What happens then? Well, the momentum dies because as those individuals sit in that meeting and they see that idea being judged, often harshly and critically, they stop their thinking. They literally stop their thinking. Who's going to suggest an idea after the initial idea in that meeting was met with such harsh criticism? We'll move to the second principle of divergent thinking. It's called go for quantity. Nobel laureate Linus Pauling perhaps said it best. He said the best way to have a good idea is to have a lot of ideas. See, the notion here is that quantity will lead to quality. We want to leverage probability. The more options you have, the more probable you are to have a breakthrough. And this has been demonstrated through Dean Simonton's research. Dean Simonton, a well-known current creativity researcher. He's looked at eminently creative individuals and he's found that the number of creative breakthroughs they generate is directly related to the amount of work they produce. Here are some examples. Nobel Prize scientists published twice as many papers as non-winners. Einstein himself had 248 publications. Edison had 1,093 patents. As we learned earlier, Mozart had over 600 compositions. J.S. Bach had 1,000 compositions. And Picasso, boy, could he go for quantity. Picasso completed more than 20,000 works in his life. Now, this doesn't just apply to individuals. This is also true for businesses. When you look at a successful product, innovation, or a service, one that got to the marketplace and was adopted, on average, a recent study showed that it took 3,000 initial ideas to get to that one successful new product or service. IDEO is a well-known design company out in the Bay Area in California. They have a toy unit. And in 1 year, this toy unit generated 4,000 new ideas. 230 of those ideas were deemed to be promising, and they went to the prototype stage. And of those 230, eventually 12 were deemed to have commercial potential and were sold to clients, from 4,000 to 12. So how did Hemingway model the go for quantity? In an interview, when asked how he comes up with a title for his books, Hemingway said this: "I make a list of titles after I've finished the story or the book, sometimes as many as 100. Then I start eliminating them, sometimes all of them." Here are some alternative titles he came up with for his book, A Farewell to Arms: Love and War, World Enough and Time, Every Night and All, The Enchantment. For this well-known book, he also displayed the go for quantity principle when he generated the endings for this book. He had, in fact, written 47 different endings for A Farewell to Arms. The number one ending was called the nada ending. Hemingway wrote the following: "This is all there is to the story. Catherine died, and you will die, and I will die, and that is all I can promise you." There was the live baby ending, which was listed as number 7, which concludes, "There is no end except death, and birth is the only beginning." His friend, Fitzgerald, suggested an ending, was number 34. Hemingway wrote the following based on F. Scott Fitzgerald's suggestion. "The world breaks everyone, and those it does not break, it kills. It kills the very good and the very gentle and the very brave impartially," he wrote. "If you are none of these, you can be sure it will kill you too, but there will be no special hurry." I'm not going to reveal the end to this book if you've not read it, but it's very different from the ones I just described. Terse in the way you might expect from Hemingway, but also more rooted in the story itself. So, what can we learn from this principle of go for quantity? What are some of the benefits? First of all, when you go for quantity, you're exercising one of the fundamental abilities of divergent thinking, fluency, which is the ability to generate many options when faced with a challenge. Another benefit is that you create more choices, and when you create more choices, you make yourself more powerful in terms of reaching your goal, whether it's solving a problem or some other goal. Such as my goal when I was looking for a doctoral program. When I had graduated with my bachelor's degree, I knew I wanted to go on for a PhD. But I made a mistake. I applied to one university, and I wasn't accepted. Now, don't feel too badly for me. When I wasn't accepted into this doctoral program, I decided to go get a master's degree in creativity, and that was the decision that created the trajectory of my life and put me into this particular field. But the next time I applied for a doctoral program, you can be assured I didn't apply just to one program. The next time I applied to 9 and was accepted by 3, which put me in a position to make a choice, to choose the option that was best suited for me. Finally, more choices means more originality. Remember the extended effort principle. The more we stretch our thinking, the more we get outside of that narrow area of familiarity, the more we get into those areas of new discovery. That's go for quantity. Let's look at the next principle. Let's start off by playing a little word association. I'm going to say a word. You think of the first word that comes to mind. Salt. Table. Up. Our minds are wired to make associations. In fact, it's predictable, probably, the words that came to mind when I said salt, table, and up. You probably said chair you probably said pepper when I said salt. You said chair when I said table. You said up, or you thought of down when I said up. It's natural. Hearing a song brings back a memory if you had that experience, or as you look around and you see something, it reminds you of something that you have to do. This occurs all the time. Our mind links ideas together, and this is a powerful source for creativity. You see, new ideas don't come from thin air. If there is a muse to creativity, the muse is past ideas. The mobile phone, the car, the internet, clearly creative. They didn't pop full and complete and perfect form. They built off of past ideas. They came from ideas that were borrowed and synthesized. This third principle of divergent thinking we call make connections. Let me give you some examples of real-life people who made connections, those superstar creators. Salvador Dali's painting, Persistence of Memory, in which a number of clock faces appear to be melting, came from a dream he had about runny camembert cheese. George Lucas was inspired by mythology and love for Westerns when he created Star Wars. Think of Han Solo. It's sort of a cowboy in a sci-fi movie. And Mark Zuckerberg built Facebook in part off of dormitory Facebooks that Harvard provided to students to identify one another, later as an online study tool, and at first as a hot or not site that Harvard promptly shut down. So how did Hemingway? Let's return to Hemingway and his deliberate process. How did he borrow ideas? Did he make connections? In fact, this is what Hemingway said. "It was no new thing to me to learn from everyone I could, living or dead." In an interview, he said it would take a day, in fact, to list everyone he borrowed ideas from. Some he did cite were Twain and Tolstoy, Shakespeare, Kipling, Bach, Cézanne, Mozart, and Dante. In fact, Hemingway said, "I learn as much from painters about how to write as I do from writers." And he not only learned from other famous eminent creators, but he learned from ordinary people. His short story, Hills Like White Elephants, in which a young American couple are discussing a simple operation, was drafted in an afternoon after a conversation with a girl. Hemingway put it as follows: I met a girl in a Parisian restaurant where I'd gone to eat oysters before lunch. I knew she had an abortion. I went over and we talked, not about that, but on the way home, I thought of the story. I skipped lunch and spent the afternoon writing. How might you make connections in your life? How might you make it a habit? Well, look around. Look at something you normally avoid or overlook. Flip through a magazine. What ideas do you get by looking at the photographs? Save those photographs that are most striking to you and return to them later and see what ideas it stimulates. Attend conferences, both within your field and outside of your field. Travel widely. Meet different people. In a later lecture, we'll learn deliberate tools that are really based on this principle of make connections. This is an important and valuable principle, and we'll dedicate time specifically to this and tools related to this tool later. Let's move to the fourth principle. It's called seek novelty. Seeking novelty is about having dreams. It's blue sky thinking. It's going big. It's trying out new things. Alex Osborne, who created these four principles for divergent thinking, said it's easier to tame down a wild idea than it is to invigorate a weak idea. What seems impractical today can be reality tomorrow. Science fiction is full of examples. Think of Star Trek in the 1960s and their communicators. And today we have mobile phones. Hemingway demonstrated this seek novelty principle. He's well known for having an adventurous lifestyle, and he believed that novel experiences were the spark to write. So strong was he in this opinion, when asked, what advice would you give to young writers? He said, get experience. And if you have no experience, hang yourself. And if you're lucky enough to survive, well, at least you can write about that. Some examples of his novel experiences that led to stories. A harrowing 10-week trip in Africa in 1933, in which he became very seriously ill, led to the novel The Green Hills of Africa. A platonic love affair in Venice inspired the novel Across the River and Into the Trees. In this lecture, we're looking at the cognitive mindset for creativity, the attitude that enables divergent thinking to really be free. Let's review these four principles. Defer judgment, go for quantity, make connections, and seek novelty. How might you apply these principles? I'm going to suggest that you apply them in at least two ways. Now, I refer to these in using two terms, guidelines and principles, and I refer to those as if they were interchangeable. Let me be very clear. The first way that you can apply these guidelines is to manage your own thinking, to make them rules, if you will, to follow. So when you're explicitly engaging in divergent thinking, use these to guide your thinking. When you decide to explicitly use divergent thinking, let's say alone, it would be good to refresh your mind, revisit these four guidelines, keep them in place as you're engaging in divergent thinking. And if you're engaging in divergent thinking with a group, it would be good to explain these guidelines so that you can create a team mindset, a shared mindset. In fact, you might even want to display these guidelines if they're being used with a group. And be sure they know the goal of divergent thinking, because most people haven't been exposed to divergent thinking. Inform them that the goal is to come up with many varied and original options. And when using it as a team, it's particularly useful to have someone there to enforce the guidelines, make sure that everyone is adhering to those rules. I encourage you to try it out. Try it out on problems that are open-ended, that have multiple right answers. For example, you might try generating ideas for a theme for a party, or solving a problem at work, places to go on vacation, generating ideas for a new business venture, maybe even thinking about new hobbies. Force yourself to come up with maybe 47 new hobbies that you might try out. Remember, creativity is like all other skill areas. It takes practice. And I suggest that when you practice this, that you stop and evaluate your performance. Remember, in deliberate practice, we have to examine our performance and seek feedback. So evaluate your performance, both individually and as a group, and see if you were able to adhere to these guidelines. I also recommend, as a second way to apply these principles, is to make them part of your life. Make them principles for living. So the second way to use them is to apply as a general principle as you go through your life. Make them habits. Defer judgment on your ideas and others just naturally. Learn to be less critical, less self-critical. When challenged, generate many options. When you're confronted with an obstacle, ask yourself, what else might I do? And what else might I do? Force your mind to make connections. Expose yourself to lots of stimuli. Intentionally look outside of your area to stimulate new thinking. In terms of the fourth principle, think in highly novel ways. Be adventurous. Be like Hemingway. Intentionally try new experiences. Be provocative in your thinking. Remember the tool we learned earlier from Edward de Bono, the Poe tool, where we generate these exaggerated statements to provoke our thinking and to provoke the thinking of others. To conclude, we can deliberately enhance our ability to think divergently. The principles that we went through in this lecture are sort of the lubricant for that skill, the lubricant to enhance our ability to engage in divergent thinking. It's going to create more fluidity in our thinking. Make these principles a way of life or guidelines in a formal meeting where you're looking to generate options. Remember, our goal here is to move our creativity from chance to on-demand. And as with evolution, by following these principles, you can literally breed greater levels of creativity. You can breed your own creativity.